Welcome to the Polymer Science Podcast. I am Dr. Alicia Buertes.
And I'm Jacob Scheckman.
In this podcast, we'll be speaking to researchers from around the world and talk to them about how their work is improving our daily lives. I hope you enjoy our conversation and that you learn something new.
Hello and welcome everyone to today's episode of the Polymer Science Podcast. Now, I'm excited to get our guest introduced in this episode. Our guest is Benjamin Alameda. He's another graduate student here at the the University of Southern Mississippi Polymer Science program. But before we get into today's interview, I'm actually excited to announce that we're introducing a new co-host to this show, another colleague of mine within USM, a friend of mine, Anthony Griffin. Anthony, welcome to the show. How about you just give our guests a quick introduction and let them know who they're hearing from today.
Hey everybody, I'm Anthony Griffin. I'm a first year graduate student in Polymer Science and Engineering at USM as well. And I'm fairly excited to join this podcast. One, to be, just like you all are as viewers, introduced to a lot more research and cutting edge knowledge being gained in the polymer science world, but also to get to know everybody as well. So thank you for having me aboard. My background, I did a bachelor's in biochemistry and a master's in polymers and cutting science in Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, if you're familiar with that. But yeah, I'm excited to learn along the way and be a part of this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. Anthony, we're stoked to have you on board. I'm sure some of our guests are probably curious about that work you mentioned out at Cal Poly. Maybe we can get an episode all about you coming up soon as a better introduction. How'd you like that?
That'd be great.
Awesome. All right. Well, now to the main guest of the show. Anthony, I'm sorry, that's enough of you. We're moving on to our other friend, Benjamin Alameda. Ben, thanks for joining us. How are you doing, man?
Hey, I'm doing really well. I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the invite. And I'm super excited to talk polymer science. So
awesome. We've heard you talk polymer science before, so we're excited to get the listeners to hear you talk about it as well. Ben's work is pretty freaking awesome, if I might say myself. But before we get into Ben's work, Ben, why don't you tell us a little bit first about your academic background, how you got into chemistry, what led you eventually to polymer science?
All right, yeah, no, I'd be happy to share. So just like Anthony, I went to Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, and got my degree in chemistry under the advisement of Phil Costanzo there. And I worked with a lot with like polymeric surfactants and things like that, dispersing nanoparticles, what have you. And then that's really where I gained my love of polymer chemistry. And from there, I was like, you know what? If we're going to do this, let's do it all the way. Let's go get a degree in polymer science and engineering. So after visiting a bunch of schools, came here to USM and just felt like home. The department's just amazing. So I knew I could do what I needed to do here. So here I am, just finishing it up. I'm on my way out the door in April. So yeah, things are wrapping up for me, and I can say I don't regret it one bit.
Awesome. It's funny you say you're out the door in April as if we're not already in April.
Oh, yeah, it is April.
Yeah. I think it's April 1st, right?
Yeah, it is April 1st.
Yeah.
All right, yeah.
No joke. So,
stuck in
man,
March.
It's coming up. What's the exact date? When do you defend?
April 26th.
Yeah, April 26th.
Yeah, so getting that dissertation wrapped up and, moving on to the industry world, hopefully. So
What's that dissertation wrapping up feel like right now?
It's not as bad as I thought it would be. After you get publications done, it's really just kind of reiterating all those things, and it's really not that bad to write an intro, a kind of a comprehensive intro, but like in conclusions and things. But if you put in your work here and you've been productive, it's to have a nice template to put it all in. It's not as bad as people say it is, I think. So
yeah, thankfully we're not the first ones to actually have to do this, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty nice.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. And what's the title of your dissertation?
Oh yeah, so still deciding on that, specifically, but it's basically degradable polymer thermosets using ketal-based chemistries is going to be, something like that, essentially. But hydrolytically degradable polymers in general, or thermosets in general.
Okay, so what does all of that mean?
All right, so thermosets. Let's start there. So
awesome.
That's what I work in, is thermosets. And so generally, if you think of plastics and polymer materials, generally subcategorized into thermoplastic and thermosets, right? So a lot of commodity polymers are thermoplastic, which means made of linear polymer chains like spaghetti, right? These big macromolecular chains. And a upon heating those, you can get above the melting temperature, glass transition temperature, and those chains can begin to flow like a liquid. And that way you can reprocess them. If you look at like water bottles or a lot of these products you use every day, a lot of them are thermoplastic based. They can be melted back down, reprocessed, and recycled. And that's great, but a lot of plastics cannot. So we think of thermosetting polymers, unlike those linear chain thermoplastics, it's like a three-dimensional spider web of polymer chains that are all interconnected. It's like one big entangled cross-link network. And so that gives it really nice properties that you don't get from thermoplastics, right? You get really high performance properties, very like high temperature resistant stuff, really good mechanical strength. And that's why we use them for the tires on your car, right? You can't melt those back down. And that's why it's a huge, ecological problem, like as far as like plastic waste. And that's for all thermosets. It's a huge problem. Plastic waste, because you don't even have the choice to really recycle them. You pretty much, if you want to dispose of them, you have to burn them. So a lot of them are just burned for energy use, so they just end up in landfills and all these things. And so yeah, we need to start thinking about these materials in a like cradle to grave approach, right? Like you're really, thinking about what's happening after their life cycle. Like clearly we want useful materials during their lifespan, but what happens when we dispose of them, or can we recycle them? And so thermosets are this huge problem right now in that sector. And so that's kind of where I come in with my research is dealing with how can we make these more environmentally friendly. And so for me, really kind of just the overarching kind of theme of my research is I basically make it to where thermosetting materials can break down in water-like conditions over time. So by putting like labile bonds, like in that three-dimensional spiderweb network I was talking about, they'll eventually break down at like a critical pH environment, or like, you can, and so my job is really to tune that degradation. So clearly you don't want to make a thermoset product. Like you don't want to make the tires on your car start degrading the minute you put them on, right? So you want to make sure they're useful during their lifespan, but then, either you can break them down in an industrial setting where you can recycle them, or, if they do end up in the environment, they'll simply break down over time, right, into non-harmful byproducts. And so that's what I've been researching, and that's what I've been doing with various different types of networks, everything from elastic, rubbery type of networks to glassy, really strong, like epoxy amine networks and things like that, and showing that we can tune degradation based off fundamental chemistry, principles.
What's maybe some applicable real-world example where this could be? You've given the tire example, but now let's talk about a specific environment that you're going to put in. You said something about pH or temperature, certain chemicals that might be around to activate that degradation. What's an example where we would put some plastic in a specific environment like that and use this?
Yeah, so I can give you one specific example on something I'm working about. So, like composite materials, like carbon fiber type of materials, like high performance epoxy, fiberglass type of materials are used in like aerospace and things like that, right? The biggest problem is there's no efficient way to recycle those. And there's these huge components, like you look at those huge windmills you see for energy production. They basically have to bury those in the ground after they're done. And so it's a huge problem, right? Like we need better ways to recycle these. And plus you're also disposing of really expensive like fibers and particles that could potentially be recycled. And so essentially what I have been working on is doing a selective, tuning the chemistry where we can degrade these, where we can potentially take these materials that we would normally just throw in the ground, take them to like a facility or something, and you could potentially put them in like a low pH solution and recycle them, and actually dissolve away the matrix and recover those really expensive fibers and fillers and things like that.
Yeah.
And that could be a huge, not only you can make a circular economy now for these like carbonaceous materials that are super expensive, but you can also now broaden the application range because now the cost is down and we can now make these cool new materials in a whole bunch of different things.
Is there any chance, if we're able to achieve this goal of say, again, I'm sticking with the recyclable tires or materials, the windmills, the things, the plastics, the composite materials that just are having to be buried or burned when they're dead, right? When we can't use them. If we can reuse all of that material, how much cost are we talking about cutting here? Do you happen to have any ballpark numbers in some kind of sectors that we could look at?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, right? Like, we have the technology, right? Is it scalable? Is it, realistic? And a lot of these, initial products and reagents we use are petroleum based. So it's a multifaceted, multivariate problem, right? Like it's not, and so I'm proud to say that at least for the materials I've been working on, a lot of them are already widely available, and so there is some potential to scale up there. But yeah, for a lot of these niche chemistries, that's a major issue. And so I can't say definitively, like cost wise, what that's going to look like, but we're going to have to, we got the wind. We got the wind going here, people.
Yeah, we're sitting out here on a beautiful day, to be honest. And I can check my watch. 68 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's California weather.
Yeah. Does anybody happen to know? None of us. Sorry, I know we have an international audience. We have smartphones in our pockets. Oh no! Should we take this long to figure out what it is in Celsius?
I don't know. It's like 24 degrees. Let's say that. No, not even. It's like
21.
21
degrees.
Okay. All right, international audience, please let us know how close we are, and whether or not we should be embarrassed. Thank you.
So, talking about biodegradable thermostats, a question that comes to mind for me is, how do these mechanical properties compare to traditional thermostats, and how close are you to achieving that same performance?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to compare to in only a small amount of time, but for at least my research, I was making recyclable carbon fiber materials. That's kind of the end of my dissertation here. And so we made some epoxyamine formulations that we compared to like a commercial variant, like BPA-based, epoxy, right? And we actually were able to get almost identical thermomechanical properties and mechanical properties, and even in some cases better overall than or a better performance than the commercially available variant. And so it's definitely able to. And so this is kind of that same design paradigm I talked about before, where we could collect these carbon fiber like materials, these strong, really, really useful materials. We could take them to like a recycling facility and then break them down in just like an aqueous solution of like pH 1 or something. And then you could potentially recycle those byproducts, and such as not only the carbon fibers, but also the byproducts from degradation, and reuse those for other types of chemistry. And so yeah, that's what I'm working on and what we've kind of shown right now. And so, yeah, that's basically.
How do you measure performance in this? You talked about being able to make some material that performed better than the counterparts or than what existed. Yeah. How is this performance measured?
Yeah, so you can imagine that you have a solid material, right? And you pull on it, like if you were to pull on a piece of plastic or pull on whatever material you can imagine, it's going to have some finite strength before it breaks, right? And so that's would be like the ultimate tensile strength of that material. And so that would be like one measurement, right? But also how that material breaks. How much does it stretch before it breaks? Is it rubbery-like? Is it really rigid? You can imagine there's all these different types of material properties that need to be characterized. And so for my materials, a big thing was like looking at what temperature does this matrix become rubbery-like? Because it's this nice solid glassy, I won't say glassy, but it's this rigid type of polymer material, which makes it really useful for a lot of high-performance applications. But if you heat it up high enough, right, those bonds start to get flexible and start, moving around those polymer chains a little bit, and and it becomes rubbery-like, right? But that's like a really interesting design parameter, right? Because, for a high-temperature application, you don't want the material rubbery. You want it solid and strong. So
okay, so I love talking about glass transition properties in general. Because that's like what I use so many different instruments to look at to get different perspectives of this property. And let's talk a little bit about glass transition right now, because everyone knows what glassy means, right? In the real world, I know that word. I know what it means.
Yeah,
I know what rubbery means. But in this context of this conversation, it can get muddled,
yeah,
right? So
sure.
What is a everyday material that we might see or touch where or something we've seen online maybe that is an example of something going from what we would call a glassy state, and what does a glassy state feel like, and what does a rubbery state feel like?
That's a good question, right? I'm trying to think of now contemporary applications and materials, but a rubbery one's easy, right? Everyone's played with like silly putty or something where it's behaves kind of almost like a rubber, or tires on your car. It's soft, right? It's flexible. But like a rigid type of polymer with a higher glass transition temperature that's above room temperature, you would say, those polymer chains are they're frozen. So they behave like a really strong, solid material. They don't flex around. And that's where the term glassy is, right? So you can imagine if you have, I'm trying to think of like a example of a certain plastic product that's rigid, but like, I don't know, like, I guess almost like the glass on your, well, I know this is not a polymer, but like if you look at the glass on your car, right? Really rigid material and it's strong enough for its application. But if you were to throw that on the ground, it might crack, it's probably going to crack, right? And that's kind of, it's not flexible like a glass. And that's what we say glassy. And there's polymers like that have those glassy-like properties. Hopefully not as fragile as actual glass, but that's just just kind of the jargon that we use for that type of material property. So, rubbery, flexible, flexible, stretchable, whatever you want to say about that. And then the glassy is rigid type of material. But of course, that rigid type of material can become rubbery above a certain temperature. Like I said, once you start heating up those polymer chains, they start kind of moving between each other. It's what they call segmental motion of polymer chains. And so with that, then you can, at a certain critical temperature, you make a rubbery-like material. And so again, those, and then the same thing with the rubbery materials. If you cool them down far enough, you prevent that segmental motion of chains, and you can make it a glassy-like material. So the glass transition temperature is this interesting point where we transition from hence the glass to a rubbery state, hence the glass or to a rubbery state to a glassy state, hence the glass transition temperature.
Right. Chemically, the material isn't changing at all. It's literally just going from feeling like you're holding essentially a piece of glass to a piece of rubber, or the other way around.
Exactly. And so, it's, and that transition is widely studied. You can just study glass transition on its own with a variety of different materials because they can behave so differently between different types of polymers, right? And so, yeah, I mean, for me, it's pretty simple. I run like certain analyses on mine to just kind of get I use a couple different methodologies to measure that. But yeah, no, it's a very complex physical phenomenon that is, it's kind of like fundamental to polymer science.
I guess on the biodegradable thermosets track, what do you think is the bottleneck currently for these types of materials in terms of commercialization? Because I know you mentioned just by yourself and you and your group, you've successfully made these systems in a lot of different models or model chemistries. So what is a limiting factor right now, and why aren't we saying this right now?
Cost. I mean, like we mentioned before, that's a huge prohibitive thing is cost. And companies, when it comes down to it, bottom line is a bottom line, right? And the problem is a lot of these commodity plastics can be made for pennies per pound, and it's actually even cheaper than recycling them. So even plastics we can recycle right now, those thermoplastic polymers I was talking about, only like 7% of those get recycled. And so it's like very dismal amount, right? Like really small amount. And because you have to collect them, you have to sort them, they're not going to be miscible together when they have to be separated by the polymer type, they have to be cleaned, they have to, be sorted. It's a whole thing, right? And so it's cheaper just to start with, reagents again and make a brand new polymer material. And so, yeah, it's, that's the major problem. You compete with these highly scalable materials that are non-degradable that are super cheap, right? And so, yeah, how do we fix that is the $1 million question, right? It's not trivial. There's a lot of variables there,
right?
And so yeah, that's the big question for the future. Absolutely, I wish I had the answer to that.
Let's talk about now some of the chemistries involved within the polymers that you're using. How you used where it's acetals, ketals, things that need to hydrolyze and degrade. What are the specific types of chemicals or polymers that you're using, right, that allow you to make something degradable?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the architecture or the networks I'm using are vastly different. I'm using like a rubbery type of bioether materials or networks, which are basically sulfur-based types of networks that are kind of a new contemporary technology for making rubbery types of materials. And with those, we incorporate what are called ketals. And ketals are normally used as like a protecting group in fundamental organic chemistry, where you can, if you want to protect like a ketone on like a molecule, like, I don't know, our target audience is wide, right? But I'm going to speak to those who have taken organic chemistry.
Yeah.
And so most of us who've taken organic chemistry probably had a lab where you had some type of aromatic molecule or like cyclic molecule, and you had multiple functionalities on it, and you needed to protect one of those functionalities so you can do some other chemistry on another one of those functionalities so you don't do two reactions at once, and then you would deprotect the other one to get the original original functionality back, for like roundabout way of saying it. But and so that works by hydrolysis. So protecting it is by removing water and putting like a group on there which protects it, and then by adding water back to it, you can hydrolyze it and remove it. And so you can imagine that these long polymer chains that interconnect in this network, if you can incorporate one of those functionalities between those polymer chains,
one of the Ketal functionalities,
you can make that linkage cleavable, right? You can, using water, like it'll cleave it, and then now you've broken a chemical bond essentially. And so you make a lot of those throughout the network. You make a network that can be cleaved over and over again using just like a water aqueous type of solution, and completely dissolve it.
So literally the water, you've made this network, and you've introduced these Ketal components specifically so that in such a way that when those degrade, the polymer starts to fall apart. It's not a long chain anymore. It's a bunch of tiny, smaller pieces.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that happens by adding water.
Yeah, exactly.
In the right environment, of course.
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
and
that's the trick.
Just rain.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so, I mean, some things may, over a long period of time, but like, and that's the trick is using this, fundamental like organic chemistry principles, using chemical structures to tune that degradation to a specific application, right? And that all depends on that environment or whatever that material is going to be used for. And so, and we need to have a handle over those things to make these materials useful and really start thinking about making thermosets more environmentally friendly.
Yeah. Before I go on, let's try and get some audio explaining what protecting group is real quick. Right, to the non. I'm just looking at maybe you know how we can say that. Explain a protecting group for people who don't know what a protecting group is. Anthony, you want to take this one?
I think the name just says it, right?
Well,
you're protecting.
All right, here I'll have a crack at it.
Okay,
I'll have a crack at it. All right, so you can imagine with molecules are reactive, right?
Right.
Like they have certain aspects or different atoms on them that react with other atoms to make chemical bonds, right? And so you can imagine if one molecule has a bunch of different reactive functionalities, which are certain combinations of atoms, right?
Like different points where it can react.
Exactly. And so maybe you want to do chemistry and change one of those functionalities to be able to react in a certain way, but you don't want to do it on another functionality on that same molecule.
On the same molecule.
And so what you would do is you would protect one of those by adding a certain chemical bond to it that would keep it from reacting with whatever type of other chemistry you're doing on that molecule. And so in this particular case, for the one I'm describing, it's a hydrolysis type of reaction. And so where you have to basically heat it up to form this type of protecting group on this functionality, and then by introduction of water, you cleave that chemical bond to deprotect it. And so it's this equilibrium of protection, deprotection using water. I hope that. Maybe I need to kind of. I'm trying to think of a simpler way to put that.
I think that was great.
Okay. All right.
A fun little tidbit.
All right.
The next question I was just going to ask. I'm curious. So we've talked about Ketals, and it helped us understand, I think, the basics of the fundamental idea of what you're trying to do. We already know you're making degradable polymers. This is one example of how it can degrade. You mentioned that Ketals is just one method. Water is just one method. What are some other ways that either you have done, maybe you've seen in the literature? How else are people trying to tackle this problem?
I mean, there's all different types of chemical bonds, right? You can use not just Ketals. There's esters and things you can find all over the place. But again, it's one of those things that there's many ways to the top of the mountain. You know what I mean? And there's a lot of ways to tackle this problem. But yeah, that was kind of the less discovered route, and so that was something I thought would be interesting to study. But there are a lot of chemistries out there and different ways of doing that. Now, you can there's so many different aspects, different types of polymers with different attributes that make them susceptible to different environments or different solvents or whatever to degrade them. You can imagine a really hydrophobic, which means, a polymer that doesn't like water. It's going to have a hard time degrading in water, right? Sorry, I keep putting my hand on the table, but and it's shaking the microphone, so I apologize. But yeah, you can imagine that having a polymer that doesn't like water, it's going to have a hard time degrading in water, right? Because of that repulsion to it. So there's a certain type of balance between like hydrophobicity and things like that you need to take into account. The other is like swelling, like of a network. Like if you got a really porous network, It could take on solvent or water and swell the material and just make it useless, even before degrading.
Literally like a sponge. It's absorbing.
And then may ruin the material properties. So it's kind of this balance between all these different factors that you have to take into account and that's why it's so complicated and why it's still a heavily researched subject, is because it's not trivial, right? There's so many different codependent variables. So yeah, that's also fun. Like for me, I like puzzles. So for me, it's a fun puzzle to work on,
Yeah. That's a kind of a personality trait. It's very helpful in grad school, I think.
I think as a scientist, you got to have genuinely like solving problems and have genuine curiosity. As long as you have those two things, you'll be fine.
And be okay with failing a lot. I'm sure you've heard that one before.
Persistence.
Sure.
Yeah, persistence is key.
Absolutely.
So can you talk about what you did before coming to USM, or did your research back in undergrad any way influence what you're doing now?
Okay, yeah. So in my undergraduate research, I worked on like polymeric surfactants, which most of us are familiar with dish soap or Dawn or whatever. And so you need to have a molecule which likes water but also dislikes water at the other end. You have this kind of two-ended, these two properties on one molecule. Where it can interact with the dirt on your hands or whatever, the hydrophobic, grease particles or whatever. But then at the other hand, it's got to be hydrophilic, where it kind of interacts with water, and that's how soap works, right? You need that functionality there of liking both water and dirt or oily things.
The hydrophobic collects the oily stuff, and the water carries it all away.
Yeah, exactly. So. So that's how soap works. But yeah, essentially though, soap isn't just used for washing hands. There's also soaps that help, clean up like nanoparticles. And when I say clean up, attach to them and disperse in like water solutions, right? Because they're technically hydrophobic, just like grease or dirt or oil or whatever. And so we have to use the same principles to be able to process a lot of these hydrophobic materials, like carbon nanotubes and things like that, these carbonaceous materials, which have really good, interesting properties, but they're difficult to process. And so being able to process them, we need kind of a soap to pick them up and put them into solution. And so that's what I worked on in my undergrad, was designing those using copolymers. So I did a lot of what they call controlled radical polymerization, and to get very well-defined, polymer chains, I guess you could say, with very specific properties to tune that affinity towards those particles and water and everything like that. So,
what does it mean to have a well-defined polymer?
That's a great question. And another one of those fundamental things like glass transition temperature is you have to, it's very important when it comes to material properties, when it comes to polymers, right? So, as I said before, these polymers are like molecular chains. They're like molecules that are really long, like spaghetti, right? And you can imagine that the physical properties of that material is going to change based off the length of those spaghetti noodles, right? So if you've got these really long spaghetti noodles, they're probably going to be more intertwined together, and they're going to be harder to pull apart, right? Whereas thin ones are going to kind of easily pull out of the system, right? So like that as an example, the length of those polymer chains profoundly affects the material properties. And so not only is it important to know the average length of those spaghetti chains, quote unquote, but also the distribution. If you've got a bunch of small ones and a bunch of large ones together, it's going to be different if you have just kind of a bunch of small ones versus a bunch of large ones, And so quantifying that in a material is super important. And so for us to be able to isolate different variables, we would use a polymerization method by combining these molecules in a very controlled way, which we could make a well-defined polymer chain of an equal length. So when we're testing material properties, we know, hey, this is the chain length that is attributing to these properties in the material. And so that's what I mean by that.
Excellent. Well said. Thank you for that education. I like that. I don't think I've ever really thanked the listeners for the explanations that I asked for, and that's a very considerate thing to do. So thank you, Anthony, for introducing me to that.
Yeah.
So moving forward, both I suppose in this show and for you, man, what's next? What do you got going on?
Just looking at some
Dr. Rollins. Oh, we have another guest. I'm glad we're recording right now, but I'm glad we picked this spot because now. It's great. We have all these people coming to stop by. This, in case for the listeners to eventually hear this, we're recording at campus, just outside the building. We got a lovely setup here. Dr. James Rollins just came by to say hello. He was a recent guest on the show. How you doing, Dr. Rollins?
Doing well. How are y'all?
We're Doing great.
Doing great.
Good.
Absolutely.
Isn't it? Yeah. It's
Yeah.
Do you happen to know in Celsius what's 68 degrees Fahrenheit?
19?
19. Okay. I wasn't sure. Their guess was 21. That's
I said
pretty close.
21. I don't think it's 21.
We figure we got an international audience, so I hope they'll let us know what's up. Have a good one. Sorry to cut you off. We were talking about what you're doing next. What do you got going on?
Yeah. So, looking for a career right now. And, it's one of those things you get to this point, and it's like, what do I really want out of a job, right? Like, there's a lot of things I think I could do well. But, like, at the end of the day, what's going to get me up in the morning and, like, make me want to go to work, And so that's been fun, and I think I've narrowed it down to what I want. And I guess maybe for those who are going to be looking for a job, it depends on what you value, like you can't get around that. But for me, it was the amount of creative freedom I get in my scientific role. So you can imagine you got two ends of the spectrum, right? You've got like a rubber stamp job where you work in you're making some commodity polymer and it's got to be exactly the same every day, and you're just rubber stamping it. You do your analysis and that's it, right? That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't keep my attention for too long. Yeah. And so, and then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got like academia where kind of sky's the limit, right? Pie in the sky, it doesn't, you have to have deliverables in terms of papers, but like, actually an application, maybe not, And so, for me, it was like, well, I need innovation. That was one of the criteria, and enough of that creative freedom where it's going to stay interesting to me as a scientist. And I think a lot of people like that. And so for me, again, I joke about it, but it's true. Like I can work in anything from cosmetics to carbon fiber. I don't really care as long as I get to innovate and solve problems and it's interesting, right? So it's not. That was a big thing for me, and I think I've isolated it down to maybe a couple different companies doing really cool stuff.
So now that you're at the tail end of your PhD career, what's one thing that you've learned that is general life advice that you would give yourself or give anybody else in the beginning of their academic journey?
Just make sure it's something you really like, because otherwise you're not going to enjoy it. Like for me, like a lot of people have different experiences in grad school. For me, I genuinely like working on polymers and chemistry. And there was never a time where, like it was hard. Like it's hard getting a PhD, but there was always things to be excited about, like developments where it kept me going because I'm like, this is really exciting findings, or we can apply this in a certain way or whatever. And so I think being able to be excited about your own science and like what you're doing is critical to your own success. And I'm not even saying I've made it yet, but like, I feel like it doesn't really matter if, I've already made it if I'm enjoying what I'm doing, right? And so PhD's if you don't enjoy it, it's going to be a really rough path. And you see people struggle through that. And, sometimes you just want to tell them like, hey, like, there's so many things to do in this world, right? There's all different types of scientific disciplines as well, not just polymer science. But yeah, without going too long-winded, just it's a career if you really like materials and solving problems. So just enjoy what you do. That's it.
Sound advice, but advice that resonates with me very much. And I'm being towards the end of my career. I couldn't agree with it more.
Your career, that's pretty quick.
Excuse me, graduate career is what I like to say. Yeah, the end of my career. Wouldn't that be something?
You're getting ready to retire.
I don't have the money I want to have at the end of my career right now. So not there yet. But Ben, that's all we got, man. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today and being outside on this beautiful day and being here for Anthony's inaugural podcast episode.
Yeah. I could not have asked for a better guest. You were one educator. You've given us life advice. You talked about your research. I don't know what more I can ask you.
I'm just a total Renaissance man right now. Seriously, thanks it was a pleasure talking to you both, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
Wish you the best.
Thank you.
Once again, a big thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in for today's episode of the Polymer Science Podcast with Dr. Benjamin Alameda. That's right, after our interview with Ben, he successfully defended his PhD dissertation and is now Dr. Alameda. Dr. Ben, huge congrats to you, man. We're really proud of you. And to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this conversation and maybe picked up a better understanding of polymer science altogether. As always, don't forget to like, rate, and subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platforms to keep in touch with all of our latest updates. And please feel free to reach out to us with any comments or questions at polymersciencepodcast@gmail.com. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.